Today is February 6th, 2024. I'm Joe Reingold, and I'm interviewing Bernie Feiwus today. Hello, Bernie. Good afternoon.
Hi. How you doing?
Tell us a little bit about your background, if you know anything about your grandparents, where they lived, and then lead up to your parents, and then where you lived as a child.
Okay, well, I am 100% Ashkenazi, Eastern European, for sure. My mother was born here, but her parents were born, one was born in Latvia, the other in Belarus. On my father's side, they were both born in Citibank, which is now Slovakia. That time was Czechoslovakia. The story on my father's side, I know a little bit more about how they immigrated. My grandfather came over in 1923. He left his wife, my grandmother, and the three small children in Citibank, which was a custom back then. He took a stagecoach from Citibank to Humani, then got on a train that went to the ship that came across, landed in New York. After 5 years of savings, he was able to send for the rest of the family, and they all came over in 1928. But the story goes with our unusual last name, the family-in-law, is that no one at Ellis Island was able to understand my grandfather's version of Yiddish or Slovakian, and that's how we wound up with this name. So we are now up to 7 males with this spelling, which is the most we've ever had, and we've checked that out thoroughly on the internet.
Have you found your original last name anywhere?
No.
No.
It was pronounced sort of like a Feiwus or Feiwus or something like that, but the rest of the family on my father's mother's side was Mendlovich, so that we've been able to trace. But on my grandfather's side, they all perished in the Holocaust. So, my dad, as I said, came over in 1923. He was in the Army in World War II. He married my mom in 1946, and I magically came along in 1948. On my mother's side, my mother was the youngest of 5 children. Her mother, I still remember vaguely, but her father died, who I am actually named after, Bernard, died very, very young. He was just 40 years old, so he died well before I was born. So we were brought up in New York, and we lived in a city housing project in East New York, Brooklyn, called the Boulevard Houses, which, now everybody has very negative feelings about city housing projects in New York. At that time, we didn't know any different. That's just the way life was. Everything was absolutely fine, absolutely normal. Went to the local public school, junior high school, went to Thomas Jefferson High School. I skipped a couple of grades. I graduated when I was a little over 16 years and 2 months. And either because of my natural inclination or because of skipping 2 grades, I was extremely shy and introverted. Went to college at 16.
Where did you go?
I went to, which at that time was called Baruch College, which was part of City College of New York. It was a business school. Now it's a separate university, but back then it was a 16-story building on Lexington and 23rd Street. So our outdoor activity consisted of the sidewalk. That was it. It was a 16-story building with 6 elevators.
And you played stoop ball down there, right?
And we played nothing.
Nothing.
There was a gym inside that had basketball and a couple of other things, but far different from normal college activity. Graduated with a BBA in statistics, of all things. Was awaiting going on active duty for my reserve unit. Worked for my uncle, who was an accountant, for a few months during tax season. Went off to my active duty. While I was on active duty, first landing on the moon, I still remember that, because we had a half day off of
To
training.
watch, yeah. Where were you stationed at that
I
point?
was stationed all the way in Fort Dix, New Jersey. So I was, again, pretty fortunate. Graduated, was released from active duty, and got my first job at what at that time was called First National Citibank, which then changed to Citibank, which then changed to Citigroup, and I think now is called Citi. But that was in 1969 I was hired. I worked there 10 and a half years. The first 5 years I worked in finance and operations, and the last 5 years I worked in credit cards. Again, very, very fortunate. It's when credit cards were in the embryonic stage. Banks could only issue one card, not both. They only issued cards in their local area because it was very, very, very expensive to do any kind of fraud protections or credit cutoffs or anything like that outside your immediate area. I won't go into all the gory details. But in '77, we issued the second card. Bank Americard was changing its name to Visa. We issued Visa, and we went nationwide simultaneously. And that was a tremendous honor and experience to be part of the team that did that. We went from 600,000 active accounts to 6.5 million active accounts in about 18 months, and operations kind of collapsed at the seams trying to keep up. We were rolling computers in like you couldn't believe. But anyway, it was a great experience. In 1980, I received a phone call from a headhunter about a position for Neiman Marcus. And the phone call to my wife said, I just received a phone call about a position in Neiman Marcus, and she said, Neiman's who? And I said, they're like Saks Fifth Avenue, but they're in Dallas. And she said, Dallas, don't you know that's in Texas? And a few months later, we wound up down in Texas.
Wait, I want to stop you for 1 second. Back up for a minute.
Okay.
How did you meet Leslie, your wife,
Oh,
and what happened in
minor
your early
detail.
marriage? Yeah, minor
Okay.
detail, just wondering.
Okay. In 1970, after I had come back from the Army, I went there. It was an alumni party at my fraternity that I went to, and I met Leslie, my wife-to-be. 3 months later, we were engaged, and 15 months later, we were married. And we've now been married for 52 years. I like to say that the first year was difficult, and then I figured out she was boss. So since then, it's been relatively easy. We lived first in the Bronx, then in Staten Island, then we bought our first house in New Jersey. We had our first child, Melissa, in 1977. Leslie was pregnant in 1980 when we actually relocated from New Jersey to Dallas. So our second child, Ian, was born here in Dallas. And our third child, Dana, came along in 1987. And unfortunately, we lost our oldest child, Melissa, when she was 37 years old, so it was almost 10 years ago, to, of all things, flesh-eating bacteria. It was awful, and it's absolutely true what people say, that the worst thing that can have happen is losing a child. But we're blessed with our other two children, and Ian has two children, our grandchildren. Micah, who just turned 13, who is my best friend, and Charlotte, who just turned 7.
Do they live here?
They all live in East Plano. And our daughter Dana also lives in East Plano separately. So we're very, very blessed that our children decided to stay in the area. And it made our decision about downsizing and moving into senior living very, very simple, because we didn't have to wonder about where to relocate to. We knew we were going to stay in the Dallas area. So
you took the job. You took the
Okay,
job with
took the job at
Neiman's, and
Neiman's.
then what happened?
And my first job was vice president of credit. And, you know, it was really at an interesting time for Neiman's. They were expanding rapidly, opening up many stores. And in fact, large stores, comparatively. And I did that for 2.5 years. I also had a flair for marketing, so I did some marketing things in the credit area. In the end of 1982, I was promoted to be controller, which I did for 2.5 years. But during the time I was in credit and in finance, I had this idea about a retail loyalty program, which became known as Neiman Marcus InCircle. And when it was launched, finally, in 1984 or 83, it's a long time ago, it was the first retail loyalty program of its kind. So that was something always to be proud of. Because of my marketing flair, I was moved over to run sales promotion and advertising in 1985 for all of Neiman's. And I did that for 6 years. In 1991, I was given the opportunity to run their catalog division. They had previously purchased Horchow. So it was the catalogs of Neiman's and Horchow, Horchow Home, Trifolds, Grand Finale. So it was a pretty big operation. And I did that for 8 years, from 1991 to 1999. Again, very, very fortunate to be given these kinds of opportunities. And I like to say that this is a great country, because where else would a Jewish boy from Brooklyn have the opportunity to be in charge of the Neiman Marcus Christmas book and select his and her gifts?
Nowhere else.
Nowhere else but in America.
Right.
So that was great. Towards the end of the 90s, I started receiving phone calls from headhunters about internet opportunities. And even though I had a great position, probably one of the best positions you could ever imagine having, I started to get the bug. So in early '99, I left Neiman's to join a startup here in Dallas. We thought we were doing real well. We were getting in a position to raise financing, and then the bubble of 2000 hit, and everything dried up. Reality stared us in the face, and it just wasn't going to work out. So I decided it was time to recoup and fall back to a real job. I was fortunate enough to become Chief Operating Officer of JCPenney Direct, which was their catalog and internet, and I did that from 2001 to 2008. And again, was very successful. Without going into too many of the financial details, we turned the money-losing operation into a very profitable operation. We shrunk the outlet store business, which was losing an enormous amount of money. They were buying way too much merchandise, and then they had the catalog and the internet had stores to divest of all this excess merchandise because the stores themselves didn't want it, the JCPenney stores. And we grew the internet from 200 million to 1.5 billion while I was there. So that was a big success. By 2008, there had been several changes of management. They wanted to combine, as many retailers did, the catalog and internet into the stores, and I decided it was time for me to leave. I did some consulting. I worked for a number of small startups, and then I retired early. Again, being very fortunate to be in a position to retire early. That's pretty much my business career. Since that time, I've gone from working 60 plus hours a week to working as little as possible and enjoying life.
That's okay.
So that's really it. And then 11 days ago, we moved from our big house in Plano here to Legacy,
Yeah,
to a villa.
I just heard. That's great.
So we're still settling in. If you feel like unpacking stuff, rearranging stuff, you come on over. Just kidding.
I'm good at that, actually.
Just kidding. So it's been really great. It was time for us to move. We decided we needed to downsize. The house was crazy big.
So tell me, what kind of things have you and Leslie been involved in through the years, civically or Jewishly? What have you been involved in?
My wife is very autistic, and she's been involved in all kinds of things. Okay, which is the big problem with downsizing, because she had taken over the upstairs of our house. She had 3, maybe 4 rooms full of our hobby stuff. And now she only gets 1 art room and part of the garage. So that's the biggest challenge. Other than that, we're working fine on the downsizing. But she does painting, she does quilting, crocheting, metalwork, beadwork, bookbinding, and something called Zentangle. She's a certified Zentangle teacher, which is a meditative art form, and I won't try to explain what that is. You could look it up. It's Zentangle. You could look it up on the internet. I have become pretty inactive. I spend lots of times with the grandkids, and I spend a good amount of time video games and watching TV. It's kind of like everything I missed for all those years of working so extensively. And I've become more active in Chabad. About 23 years ago, my wife went to a course. Well, let me go back a second. Her family was very, very reformed. My family was modern Orthodox, but my grandparents and their whole family were Hasidim. Okay? In fact, the story goes that if you go to Bnei Brak in Israel and you walk down the street, half of the people look like my aunts and uncles and grandmothers. Very, very Hasidic. So anyway, we were always members here of Shereth Israel, then Anshe Torah. My wife goes to a course at Chabad of Plano in 2000 and 2001, run by the Jewish Learning Institute on Kabbalah. She's always been fascinated by Kabbalah. So she comes home and she says, "This is great, this is wonderful, this is home, this is everything, you gotta come." I said, I don't know about Hasidism. Because the way I was brought up is it was everything or nothing. And I knew I couldn't do everything, so it became a relatively easy decision to do practically nothing. As the kids grew up, of course, we were members of a conservative synagogue, so we were somewhat active. It took her almost a year to get me to go to an event at Chabad, which was a Purim event. And 3 hours later, I was dancing around the synagogue with Rabbi Block. And since then, we've become more and more active with Chabad, of Plano in particular, but Chabad in general. I've been to 770, I've been to their summer retreats, I've been to trips to Israel with them. And it's really interesting because I'm not very observant, but I love the history, the heritage, the overall feeling. And the Chabad's a very small congregation. I mean, it's a couple hundred families, tops. It's not like Shereth, than the big ones. But it's very, very homey. And so that's pretty much what I do. Also love to travel. Love to travel. Love to go on cruises. COVID knocked us out for 4 years of cruising, which is really pretty bad. And when we first found Legacy, because we looked at about half a dozen different places, and it was an easy choice for us because we didn't want to go to an apartment. We had the means and the wherewithal to get a villa, which is kind of like a little house with its own garage and stuff like that. But when we first saw Legacy, we said, this is amazing. It's like a cruise ship that doesn't go anywhere.
Right. All the amenities without the water.
All the amenities, no water.
Right.
Okay. And you know, if you get off the ship to go sightseeing, you're always in Dallas. So it's been a real experience. And that's really Bernie's story.
I have a question for you. Through your years of business and all of the things that you've done and accomplished, can you think of anybody who you would consider your mentor?
I had two, very, very fortunate. Okay, and I'm not sure whether either of these gentlemen would agree that they mentored me. Okay, because it was subtle. It wasn't like, come here, Bernie, take you under wing, let me tell you what to do, all that stuff. It was more leadership by example and admiration for what they did. The first fellow was a guy named Dave Phillips. I worked for him at Citibank. First, he was controller of something called the operating group, and I was a financial analyst. I used to sign things NT, which stood for no title, because everybody in the bank had a title. I didn't have a title, so I signed it NT, which infuriated everyone in the bank, but got me noticed. And then later, he was the one, 2 or 3 years after that, where he had gone one way, I had gone the other way. He wound up being in charge of something called Card Products Division. And I went over to be his financial controller of the division, and then moved from that into credit extension, collections, operations under him. So he was the first one. He was a Harvard MBA graduate. I was going, when I first ran into him as a financial analyst, I was going evenings to Pace College in New York trying to get my MBA. And he came into me and said, why are you bothering doing that? I said, what do you mean? He says, are you getting anything out of it? I said, absolutely not. Okay. He says, well, let's apply to get you in Harvard. I said, Dave, I don't know where you're coming from, but you know, brought up in a low-cost city housing project, went to Baruch School, you know, City College. He says, no, he says, I want you to send away for an application. So I said, okay. He's my boss, what am I going to say? A week later, he comes by, he says, you get your application yet? I said, no. He says, you didn't send away for it, did you? I said, no. He said, here, start filling it out. So we filled it out, and magically, I was waitlisted for acceptance. Back then, this is ancient times. This had to be 1973. Harvard used to get about 10,000 applications for the business school a year. And they would accept 700 and they put 100 on the waiting list. I was waitlisted. So we were trying to find out where on the wait list I was, which is like top secret. Long story short, I didn't get in. So I never went to Harvard, stopped Pace, never got my MBA. But
you didn't really need it.
But as it turned out, I didn't need it.
Right.
And it was just so many things that he did that taught me leadership. I'll give you one example. When I became control of card products, one of the things that was interesting at Citibank back then is that everybody filled out expense reports, and there were guidelines but not rules. And I always played it straight by the law, the sharpest interpretation of the law. And I knew other people were a little bit more liberal than I was. So I put in, as control, I put in for our division, which was 160 professionals, but it was thousands of people, guidelines, which I considered to be rules. And one of it was that I said all of the expense reports for our division, the professionals, have to be approved by me. And I went over to the payables department, and I said, look, these are our expense codes, XXX to XXY. And all of these have to have my signature on them. And the guy, the head of the department, comes out and says, I think you're asking for a lot of aggravation, but we applaud you, because we see all kinds of stuff come through here. Okay, and we applaud you. Okay, good luck. And we did it. We did it. And, there was some interesting conversations, to say the least. But to show you how Dave was, he would not sign his own expense reports to turn into his superior until I signed off on it. His superior at that time was a fellow named John Reed, who ended up being chairman and CEO of Citibank, and a world-renowned banker. Okay, so stuff like that, okay,
Showed you leadership.
shows you leadership and gives you a demonstration. Now, I could also say that I learned a great amount from some people I worked for and with about what not to do. We won't name those and describe those instances. The other mentor I had, I was working at Neiman's. It was 1988. I was running sales promotion and advertising. And Richard Marcus had been chairman and CEO. We had a new parent company called General Cinema. Remember the cinema theaters?
Sure.
Okay, well, they were out of Massachusetts, just out of, forget the name of the town, it's just outside of Boston. And they bought controlling interest in retailers, including Neiman's. And they replaced Richard Marcus with a fellow named Alan Questrom. Alan Questrom had been in Federated Macy's for a long time, extremely good reputation. Nobody knew him. No one knew him. So all the people on the executive committee, there were like 10 or 11 of us, were asked to prepare presentations for Alan's first day. And the people from General Cinema, the executives from General Cinema came down, Alan was there, and then each one was going to give a presentation about their areas, blah, 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 this, that, and the other thing. And so then the 10 of us, or however many there were, had to decide what order would they go in. Because you had operations, you had finance, you had merchandising, you had stores, you had sales promotion, all the different areas. I think there were 3 or 4 head merchants. There was no head merchant, but there were 3 or 4 individual merchants. And, I thought finance should go first, okay, to give a lay of the financial structure and the condition of the company. But I lost out on the vote. So of all things, sales promotion and advertising was supposed to go first. We were also all supposed to get an hour. So I go in there and I have this book, binders with sections. And I had met the other people from General Cinema, but I really didn't know any of them. So I'm sitting on this side of the table, Alan's on the other side of the table, and the people like all around. None of the other executive committee members were in there. You went in one at a time. So I go and I start going through the book, and Alan is a man of a million questions. Okay. Extremely sharp, extremely merchant-oriented, retail-oriented, but just asks tons of questions. So we're going through and going through and going through, and the hour whizzes by, an hour 15 whizzes by, an hour and a half whizzes by, an hour 45 whizzes by. Okay, 2 hours goes by, and we're not done yet. Okay. And Dick Smith, who is the chairman of the parent company, General Cinema, says, Bernie, this has been great, but there are a lot of people waiting outside. Okay. We really need to move on, continue. So I said, but there's one thing I have got to discuss with you guys before we leave, and it was a very controversial thing. It was closing something down. I won't go into all the gory details. My predecessor had started it, he had left, I had inherited it, and in my mind it was a disaster, it should be closed down. But I had I could never get anybody ahead of me to agree with me, and I said, this is a perfect opportunity. So okay, I said, this is the perfect time. So I said, look, this is a story, this, that, okay. And the chairman of the parent company, the president of the parent company said, Alan, what do you think we should do? And Alan says, I've been here for 2 hours and 5 minutes. I think Bernie's proven in the last 2 hours that he knows what he's talking about. Why don't you ask him what we should do? And I said, close it down. And he says, I agree. Done. Let's go. Done. And I walked out of the room, okay, and the other 9 people in the executive, how'd it go, you were in there so long, how'd it go? I said, piece of cake, you guys will love it. And Alan wound up hiring me at JCPenney in 2001 after my internet flop. So those were my 2 mentors. And Alan was world-renowned retailer. He ran Neiman's, he ran Macy's, he ran Barney's for a while, he ran Penny's. Always a tremendous success. Great guy.
Well, you certainly had a wonderful whirlwind business career, that's for sure.
Sure did.
Fantastic. Well, we're happy you're here.
I'm happy I'm here.
I just have one other quick question for you. Since you've been in Dallas for many, many years, what changes have you seen since you first got here? In a nutshell, what do you think?
Oh boy. 1980 we moved down. Our first house was on Preston and Arapahoe. Mm-hmm. The tollway ended at LBJ. Central was 2 lanes each way. Preston Road was 1 lane each way north of Beltline. Mm-hmm. Okay. Frankfurt, between Preston and, at that time, the Parkway, now the tollway, had a bridge on it that was 1 lane both ways. So you had to stop at the edge of the bridge and make sure nobody was coming the other direction. When we went banking, at that time there was single branch banking in Texas. And I had to go into Republic Bank for some reason. I was in my car. I was with a native Texan. Okay, and there's no parking signs all over the place, right in front of a 39-story building. Okay, because single branch banking, that's where they were. I said, Billy, we got to find a spot to park. He says, no, just park it here. I said, but Billy, there are no parking signs all over the place. Okay, he says, that's just for the tourists. Okay, you can park here for a few minutes, we'll go in, we'll take care of it, we'll come right back out. That was a little bit of a difference from being born and raised in New York. Dallas at that time was a small city.
Yeah.
It really was. If I remember correctly, DFW had about 3 million people in it. And now, 44 years later, it's 8 million people. So the changes have been unbelievable. Unbelievable. It's, you know, Plano was like this little farm community on the outskirts. Frisco was like, I don't know, had a stagecoach or something. I don't know what was in Frisco. Okay. You know, so the culture here was practically non-existent. The museums were, need I say, awful. The zoo was pretty bad. We used to take the kids to the Fort Worth Zoo. The Dallas Zoo wasn't even that good. The synagogue was fine because we went to Sheriff. You know, so
It was established.
from that place, and JCC was there, the synagogue was there, so that was all established. Getting to find decent Italian food, Chinese food, you know, was a challenge. The recommendations that I got from the native Dallasites were pretty bad. So it's really grown in so many ways. You know, and
No regrets moving here?
You know, I never had any regrets. My wife was missing New York until we went back the first time. And then she says, Dallas is home. You know, over the years, I've had several opportunities to go back to New York. And, you know, I even considered one or two. But when you start to think of all the details involved, it's not just the position, it's the living. So for us, you know, it was very, very fortunate we found Dallas. Do we like the summers? The heat? No, we've gotten a little bit more used to it. Do we like the winters? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And, you know, the ease of getting around, it's a much better standard of living. It's a lot easier to live here. It's a lot happier to live here.